As is normal with most of the stuff I come up with, there are a couple of places that the idea for BODARK came from. And as is normal with most of the stuff I come up with, one of those places was just a couple of paragraphs in a book I bought from a second-hand shop. That book was called The Phantom War, and it was a history of Russian partisan activities and deployments during World War II. In essence, the first half of the book explains how the partisans were pretty spontaneous and pretty disorganised and treated quite badly by Joseph Stalin and the Russian army. A lot of the time because they wouldn't conform to what they were told, because they conducted themselves in a relatively non-standard or non-political way. The Russian army was quite suspicious of them, sometimes accusing them of having similar ideologies to the Germans themselves. They would attract the kind of people who didn't toe the party line, who had political disagreements. And so they were essentially sent to die. They were just sent on missions where it didn't matter whether they came back or not. But with the failure of Operation Barbarossa and the victory at Stalingrad and the turnaround, at that point, the Red Army realised that there was actually potential to use the partisans for missions that had a purpose. Each group was given organisation, funding, new weaponry that had come from the UK and the US, and then they were sent out on surgical missions rather than just turned loose like cannon fodder. And from 1943 onwards, one of their key priorities of partisan activity in Russia was the rail network. The only way the Germans could effectively get reinforcements and ammo to pinch points on the battlefront, which was vast, was via the Russian railway network. So the partisan groups just struck relentlessly both at the rails and tracks themselves and the trains the Germans were using, to the point where the Germans literally had to have guard houses every couple of 100 metres along the rails and regular patrols. And unsurprisingly, given the size of the Russian rail network, they just couldn't defend it. It was impossible. Everything they tried failed. Their guards, their dogs, they couldn't patrol such vast stretches. And as a result, they couldn't then get reinforcements to the front line. And the partisan war on the rails was one of the key factors why the Germans could not succeed in Russia. Arguably, Germany's most famous armoured train were the couple that Adolf Hitler used to move around in. And I've described them already in the factual video I did on the channel on Operation Foxley, which was the British efforts to try and assassinate Hitler. But it wasn't the only one the Germans used. Armoured trains had been used extensively in a number of prior conflicts, notably the American Civil War and the Boer War, as well as the Great War itself. Their primary role was one of reconnaissance. They would shuttle up to the front line and sometimes up and down it, note what was going on, and then pass those messages back safely to the commanders that had dispatched them. But as the nature of warfare changed, as artillery itself became more mobile, culminating in aerial warfare, World War II would be the last time they were efficiently used. Armoured trains have been used in a limited format after World War II. Ironically, the Russians probably retained the idea the most during the Cold War, but they haven't really got a place in modern warfare. The German attitude towards trains was essentially the same as they took towards any aspect of armoured warfare, which was essentially to just throw paint and see what stuck. A bit like with their tank destroyers, they would take a basic Tiger chassis and then would weld various weapons and turrets to it and see what worked. If you were crewing it and it didn't work, unlucky. If you were crewing it and it did work, unlucky in a couple of months when you get overwhelmed by Allied forces. But as a result, the trains they used, much like their tank destroyers, ended up with a whole range of steampunk and Frankenstein-like creations, no two of which were the same, all of which looked pretty impressive. They were proper marquee pieces, visually stunning. but they couldn't survive the tracks being blown up underneath them or being jumped by rocket-firing American aircraft. So ultimately, they were a bit useless. But like I said, nice to look at. The one I've pulled together for BODARK is reflective of the war on the rails and the armoured trains themselves. It's not a genuine train that existed. Due to a lack of resource, you would have found that the carriages used on the network would have been cattle carriages, whatever the Germans could lay their hands on, and then they would have used what limited armoured resources they had for protection to move it back and forwards. So in essence, I've done my usual trick. I've taken 12% of one story and 12% of another story, and then I've crossbred them and created a quarter of a new story. I think it works. If it doesn't work, just tell me. The first thing you guys need to know about the BODARK is probably the most important thing of the lot. And that is, if you're writing a story about the BODARK, it will nearly always autocorrect to the word bodacious. Maybe that ages me, but I think that's cool. Nothing else matters. Russian culture is fairly bonkers, and as a result, the Russians have two different types of werewolf. Seems a bit selfish, if I'm honest. The first, and as always, pardon the pronunciation, is known as the Warkalak. Wakalak? Warkalak? Warkalak. And that is a very traditional type of werewolf. It is a poor, unfortunate individual that has been cursed, usually by the devil or a witch, and they have to morph into a monster when the moon is full. The interesting thing about the Warkalak is that it isn't generally considered to be evil. The monster retains its human consciousness, and these individuals will wander from village to village, seeking out food and shelter, trying to hide their curse from the other villagers, and then move on. When they did transform, they didn't really do evil things, so a lot of the time they were seen as mysterious spirits and guardians, cursed by the fact they could never settle anywhere, and they had to move on. So a little bit like the littlest hobo, but slightly more unstable and dangerous. Appreciate I age myself with a quote like that. The BODARK is a bit more of an interesting candidate, in that a little bit like a Skinwalker or a Wendigo, somebody has to go through the time and effort of performing an ancient ritual to become a BODARK. This usually involved going out into the woods, stabbing a tree with a copper knife, and then chanting a rite or an incarnation. Again, the BODARK retained its human consciousness and memories, and they had the advantage that they could transform into a wolf at will, day or night, regardless of what was going on with the moon. And if they were bad people, they were bad BODARKs. And if they were good people, they were good BODARKs. Which then brings us to our old friend and comrade, Sergeant Linz, or Dieter to his friends. In terms of Dieter Linz, the number of appearances he's had to date depends entirely on how closely you follow detail in the episodes. He's obviously, as anybody would know, a key factor in the events of Covenant, and that puts him and the survivors of his platoon in rural France in March of 1942. But now here we are in August of 1943. The first 1943 story we've done, yes. He actually does, however, make a cameo at the start of Custodian, which is where he first meets Gerhard Haas. He and his platoon were amongst the Fallschirmjäger who took part in the battle at Ebenemal, but you wouldn't have noticed that unless you noticed a little reference to him. So clearly, since Covenant, him and his boys have been transferred to the Russian front as Barbarossa has collapsed and the tide of the war has turned. But he wasn't present for the events of Custodian himself, which was quite wolf-themed. So how's he gained his powers, you ask? I heard you asked. Well, we're going to do a first for the channel now, for the 700 or so of you that watch these videos, and we're going to put a spoiler alert in place. I'm going to tell you a rough idea how he got his powers, and if you don't want to know, I would mute the channel and, or fast forward, do whatever works for you, and come back to it after the spoiler alert disappears. When I was a far younger man and far less jaded by the ways of the world, certainly not the wizened old goat I am now, I used to write stuff for fun, like with no agenda. And one of the first stories I wrote was about a German base minding its own business in the dying days of World War II, scared largely of Americans, which is attacked by werewolf-like monsters. And it turns out the monsters are Fallschirmjäger, who were experimented on by nasty scientists, turned into werewolves, using a disease or a strain of virus that had been discovered in the woods in Yugoslavia or somewhere similar. And they all get sent to the Russian front, where unfortunately they get captured, they get tortured by Siberians and crucified on trees to die. Only overnight, they don't die. They turn into werewolves, and they break down from the trees, and they massacre the Siberians, and then they decide they're going to go home and have a word with their bosses. And when they get back, they find that their masters have created a new, far worse generation of monster and werewolf, and all hell breaks loose. I don't know how much of that in its entirety I'll retain moving forwards. Definitely some elements of it, but I'll have to retcon it to match what's gone on before in the channel. So there probably will be a werewolves versus Siberians morph at some point, and maybe ultimately Lynn's catching up with his bosses. Regardless, I think we can agree that they're en route home now, and in the year or two it's going to take them to get there, they might well hook up with a few other familiar faces and friends. Who knows? I'm kind of winging it, if I'm honest. You'll be pleased to hear, maybe you won't after you've heard this, that the next story for the channel has been written and it's been sent across to Sean, and he's rendering the artwork for it as we speak. And I'm hoping, praying, it's a good one and it will be received well. From the start, if we go back across the UK lines, there are two guys working there during the course of this channel, very much on a collision course with one another. I just used the word course twice. Come on, I'm better than that. On one hand, there's the quite physically damaged and very cross Commander Stanley Shepherd. And then on the other, there's the very diligent but slightly emotionally damaged Amos Armitage. So let's just say for a second that somebody's decided that they need to work together as a unit for the British Army to sort out all these weird things that are going on. But again, for the more eagle-eyed amongst you, certainly during the events of Todd, they don't really align to each other in terms of their ideas and values. They get quite cross with each other over things like hanging German pilots. And what if one of the missions they were sent on together, only one of them comes back? Who lives? Who dies? Potentially, who cares? Anyway, it's going to be called Gehenna, and it will be with you next month. Probably without one of the protagonists by the end of it. Anyway, as ever, I'm going to end it with the same spiel I always end it. If you've got stories or ideas or feedback, email me. If there's something you want to do to help the channel or to work on it, email me. If you just want to take the mickey out of me, please, I've got a boring life. Email me. And if you don't email me. Right. I'll see you guys next time round. Goodbye now.